I just wanted to remind everyone that we are recording also this session. So if at any point you do not wish to be recorded, please could you switch off your video and audio. Each speaker, we have got 3 papers in this session, and each speaker has 25 minutes to deliver the paper. I will be giving each presenter time reminders when they have about 5 minutes left. And like Sila this morning, I'm going to use a very traditional method of just showing off and waving my piece of paper. We will be taking, excuse me, some questions after each presentation, but I am hoping that there will be time towards the end of the session for some general discussion. I don't want to delay any further the start of the session, so I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, John Courtneige, whose paper is entitled "The Aim of the Cooperative Movement, a Global Cooperative Commonwealth." Over to you, John.
Right, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for our fellow cooperators and all participants. I have simply produced a manuscript paper, all handwritten, not a PowerPoint. I'll mention a PowerPoint that means that if you want to catch up on this, that PowerPoint pre-exists. I've also got something like a running order. So my first happy task is my opening thanks. I'd like to thank the people that have been growing our food and distributing our food and cooking it, and like me, who will then have to do the washing up. I'd like to thank Rory and the organisers of this conference in these astonishing times for all the work that they put into that. And finally, my thanks are to COVID-19, because were it not to COVID-19, I wouldn't see the inside of all of your homes in such glorious variety. Those of us like Richard and myself who've been self-funded activists have worked out of our bedrooms. So in the spirit of that, there is my unmade bed, and down below is a pile of books in the distance there that form the basis of this paper. You're going to see a million and other books as well. 3 that didn't get into the paper, which of course are probably the most important ones, are the spirit level, with the important diagram in the middle here in chapter 1, which basically says a society needs to be doing some activity for wellness to increase. And then beyond that, nothing happens except we pollute the planet. So there is one of our Quaker cards. Whether this is in fact cooperation or mutuality is a different kettle of fish. Bill Gates and Ted Turner want in fact to kill us all off. The other alternative is that we become self-sufficient by chopping wood and carrying water. I'm not so sure that's the way forward. But the theme effectively of this conference is social economics. There's an older book which deals with that. So first of all, I'd like to read the dedication in my paper to you. I should like to dedicate this paper to a number of fellow cooperators, most of whom I think are now deceased. They include, from Hertford, Evelyn Thompson; from Welling Hatfield, Frank Clayton, Margaret and Henry Tock. I hope that many of us older geezers might remember the Tocks at co-op party meetings. Marvellous friends. Meg and Rob Lloyd. I'm not sure if they're still alive or not. And from Canada, Mark Goldblatt, Ian McPherson and Ed Finn. Again, I hope that Ed is still alive. I'll mention his contribution in all this. And overnight, I realised that I must include Jackie Walker in my dedication. The title, the more extended title that I've written is The Object of the Cooperative Movement as the Establishment of a Global Cooperative Commonweal composed of local and national cooperative commonwealths by the implementation of the Living Plan sometimes I mistype it as the loving plan, the living plan for cooperative socialism, and historical review and future prospects. Now that turned up as a manuscript of 20 pages. You will be pleased to know that I'm not going to read all 20 pages to you. What I am going to do, on the other hand, is to read from this briefly if I can. I'm aware I'm trying to fit this into 15 minutes. Read some interim closing remarks. The entries in the Complete Oxford English Dictionary for the terms cooperation, cooperative, cooperator, cooperative commonwealth, cooperative commonweal look to be a rich resource to extend this study. I hope other people will pick up aspects of what I'm talking about. I have no sense of ownership of anything. In fact, this is a red letter day for me in this, or red letter weekend. I've actually started giving away my library. The problem with that is that, of course, in the post this morning, 2 more books turn up. One is a book that I read as a child in the Chislehurst Public Library called The Moffats. That's great. I hope my grandchildren will enjoy it as well. And the other one, I'm really a bus nut rather than a train nut. That's turned up. So, of course, as you try and give away books, more come in the front door. There it is. To that resource, the Complete Oxford Dictionary, I'd also point fellow cooperators to the British Newspaper Archive. I'll mention an 18th century newspaper called Lloyd's Register in a bit, but the Reynolds News in the 19th century has certainly been helpful for me. So, referring to that 18th century report from the Woolwich shipwrights, it's been pointed out by Stephen Yeo, and before that another excellent author that Stephen draws on, C.R. Dobson or Dodson. Anyway, masters and journeymen, that in the 18th century, the Woolwich dockyard was probably the largest industrial site on the planet since Roman times. And in that book, one of the so-called artificers told one of the political lobbyists to clear off. He said that he would report the artificer to the relevant authorities, and the artificer said, "Don't worry, I will report myself before you get there." That to me is the freedom of the cooperative alternative. I won't read the exchange, but it's in both of those books. Indeed, as Dobson writes, shortly afterwards, the Society of Shipwrights came into existence in 1759. It's the earliest cooperative enterprise that I can find at the moment. Not as a trade union, but as a retail cooperative society. It opened a bakery at Chatham, a corn mill in Woolwich, as illustrated in Ron Roffey's book referenced earlier, and that's in the main text, a map of which is on the internet, looking at the time, and a butcher's shop in Church Street, Deptford. So I don't think there's anyone here who would argue that cooperation is not innate. And my puzzle for others to delve into is, how is it that those shipwrights in the Thames estuary, at Woolwich, at the Chatham Royal Dockyard, and at Sheerness, again a Royal Dockyard, and Deptford before that, had realised that the solution to their problems was a cooperative solution rather than an individualist solution, and that it was cooperative rather than a formative trade union. Many other people have contributed to that, and that'll be in the main text. I'll skip over the fact that cooperation is in fact something that's evolved right across the planet So when I first became a member of the UK Society for Cooperative Studies, it was called the Society for Cooperative Studies. And in a fit of post-colonial political correctness, we added the two letters UK. But I actually think today's or this weekend's presentations show that we're actually the, if not a, society of or for cooperative studies. And our internationalist outlook is an important aspect to all of that. So in the pile of books and in the 30-odd references, there are references to the growth of the cooperative movement in Western United States. The United States, despite the media presentation, is a hotbed of cooperative activities, much of which is within what you might imagine to be capitalist communities like the Republicans. But that's a different kettle of fish. So I finished then, well inside my self-appointed 15 minutes, with the interim reflection C at the end of this, which really is the meat of what I'm talking about. And if you'll allow me, I will try my best to read this out, because this relates to l'économie sociale and l'économie solidaire and forms of cooperative activity. So C, what might a global cooperative commonweal and say a UK cooperative commonwealth look like following the implementation of the Living or Loving Plan for Cooperative Socialism? Starting, and for this audience, with workplace systems, organisations and objectives, we see that all workplaces be reorganised as probably one of 4 different types of cooperative. I'm a doctor, you know, a PhD in chemistry, so I can't even read my own writing. It's a terrible thing, this, isn't it? But there it is. So 2 cooperative forms in l'économie sociale and 2 in l'économie solidaire, the solidarity economy and the social economy inverted. In the first pair, monopoly province cooperatives will generate their own financial surpluses. In other words, in the social economy, whilst we still use money, and that's a time-limited thing, those social economy cooperatives, be they monopoly community cooperatives, will generate a financial surplus, which will go to the common purse. And in the diversity of provision sector, which people call the market, I don't like to use that word because it has so many connotations, so I use the phrase diversity of provision. Those worker cooperatives, again, will produce financial surpluses whilst they're trading for money, and those surpluses again go to the common purse. In the other type, the 2 sorts of solidarity cooperatives, l'économie solidaire, both the monopoly type will require financial subsidy from the common purse, and the diversity of provision group will again require financial subsidy from the common purse. I would say that although it's not spoken of here, the fact that the plan includes a guaranteed living income for everyone means that a lot of human activities will be self-funded by the participants, which is what Richard and I have done for so many years. And I tell you, it's not much fun, but it works. We survive. So in the l'économie solidaire, the monopoly provision, for example, would be a community cooperative form of the National Health Service. And by National Health Service, I talk about National Health and Social Care Service. This is something that goes back to my time as a town councillor and etc. in Hertfordshire. Let me see where, because I'm not actually reading this. As to the other 4 aspects of the plan for cooperative socialism, I'd like to point fellow cooperators to this reader on cooperative socialism, which is a place where you can see the wording, 2010 wording of the plan for cooperative socialism. That CCPA, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, reader is in the papers section of the interest-free money website, www.interestfreemoney.org. And as we speak, my fellow Quaker in Canada, Jeanne Broughton, has finished a manuscript of a book, which hopefully will be published under both of our names. And so to round this out, when you've been micking around with all of this for such a long time, odd bits of paper get lost in your notes and then reappear. You can't read that, so I'm going to read what I wrote for Kitty. This is back in, oh, heaven knows, 2010, I think, 2011. The cooperative commonwealth, i.e. a world of cooperative socialism, is a world of human and ecological cooperative relationships rather than a warfare of coercive human and ecological relationships. I'd like to close by thanking everyone who's managed to stick with listening to all of this rather than enjoying a nice flashy PowerPoint. That's also in the papers section at interestfreemoney.org from our new LANEC conference that Ian mentioned earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this really thoughtful and enriching presentation. I have to say, I have much enjoyed not having a PowerPoint. They can be brilliant, but they can't quite replace this sort of interaction that that creates with between the audience and the speaker when there's a paper leader. So I appreciate the change. Are there any questions or comments for John? It's great that you actually ended a bit earlier because we might have more time for discussion. I think Gillian had a comment in the chat.
And also there are hands being raised, Rory and Pat Graham, I've noticed.
Sorry, I don't think we're able to see their hands.
John?
Oh, yes, Pat, would you like to go first?
John, thank you very much for your presentation. I am too giving away books at the minute and buying more. Can I say I have a background in community work, working in the mining industry, and then laterally learning and development in the corporate sector and in mediation. And the question I have, I'm here as a co-op member. I shop with a co-op. And the question I have is, how do you resolve difference within cooperatives? You know, we all are passionate about what we want to do. There's a potential for conflict. And I just wonder, have you any comments on that?
Given that I think by that clock we've got 6 minutes, why don't we just hoover up all the questions and I'll try and weave them together. Would that be all right?
Thank you.
I will not do the politician's trick of ignoring ones that I don't like.
We've got a bit more than 6 minutes, John, just for information, because the next paper starts at 2 o'clock. So we've got plenty of time, but if you prefer to collect a few questions before responding, that's fine.
Yeah, let's do that, because I know what it's like when you're waiting to ask a question.
Rory, would you like to?
Yeah, mine's more of a comment, but there was something that you said in your talk reminded me of a discussion in the preface about the recovered companies in Argentina. It was a translation of material in Spanish by the college, which is that cooperation is what you do when you stop trying to organize people. So moving to that spontaneous voluntary association, cooperation is an emergent property of an egalitarian culture. People often say how difficult it is, but I think you can argue that it's not difficult if you stop trying to structure and manage people. Yeah.
Thank you. Got that?
We've got Neil, who has her hand up. Hello, Neil. You're muted, I think. Or we can't hear you anyway.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if sure I can hear you, but I'll just make a point and ask questions. Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. And I know it was just generally sketching things out, the idea of cooperative socialism. But I wonder if what more could be discussed about that from the point of view of the role of the state in such a situation. What would be the relationship between this idea of cooperative socialism and the state? I mean, this is an issue that goes back a long way, of course, right to the origins of the cooperative movement. And to me, it's a barrier that has to be discussed. And also, of course, trying to expand cooperatives in a national and an international level, as the speaker outlined, doing that at the same time where the dominant interests are of big business and private industry and private ownership. And, all historical experience would show that trying to push that back and have a more socialized economy, cooperative economy, is going to come up in a collision with the state and with private interests. And then that brings on to political issues and what sort of, you can't avoid the politics of this as well. So whilst I agree fully with the general idea of a cooperative socialist type of economy, it's just that there's some, big issues there I think have to be addressed. But I know it's just a general sketch has been given at the present time. And then there is the issue also of once you have cooperatives, is the question of, like all large organizations, of bureaucracy and how you deal with that. I mean, it was mentioned, I think, the idea of a cooperative NHS, cooperative health service, and I'm all in favour of more direct democracy and participation throughout the whole cooperative movement and in things like the NHS or other public sectors. But again, how do you get around the question of the bureaucracy? That's, you need a certain level of administration, obviously. How is that controlled? What's the democratic procedure there as well? Because we know with some of the big massive co-ops that have developed, there's been big problems with them as they become a bit more differentiated, I think, and more isolated from the general cooperative members and movement. So, it's just a few things to be interesting to hear some comments on that. And I should just say, I'm now in Mulholland, and my background is housing co-ops. I'm in the I'm on the executive of the London Federation of Housing Cooperatives, but I've really enjoyed this conference over the last 2 or 3 days, although I've been only able to nip in and out because I've been working at the same time, but I've enjoyed the discussions. Thanks.
Thank you.
John, would you like to perhaps at this point respond to the comments you've received?
I'm happy to do that. I just don't want to run the risk of knocking someone out who wants to speak.
I can't see any hands up at the minute, but I'll keep monitoring while you speak.
Okay. So Pat's question about resolving differences in cooperatives. The key message from the spirit level is that as you create greater income equality, the amount of conflict in society reduces. And so the present levels of conflict and troubles within families, communities, within workplaces, even cooperatives and worldwide will disappear once we have created a global cooperative commonweal. Wheel means wellness, wealth, wheel, and all that merry stuff. And sometimes those conflicts cannot be resolved. And that's why within the plan for cooperative socialism, there is the notion that everyone should receive as of right a guaranteed income, which we refer to as a living income for everyone, LIFE. There's a lot of stuff at the moment about universal basic incomes, and that's a capitalist plot, but I won't go into that too much at the moment. That then relates to Rory's question about the emergence of cooperation. The emergence of competition emerges as hierarchies are created, because that's a whole set of power relationships all the way up and down. if we create a much more equal society, then we will be in a position where there are fewer conflicts. People will not be able to be organised because they can basically walk out the door and say, sorry, I can't use this sort of word in Littlehampton, I'm a Kennington boy, F you, I'm off out of here. So I think the emergence of the cooperative commonwealth and the cooperative commonweal is very much related to this income equality point. And that then brings me to Neil, Neil's point. I hope I pronounce your given name, Neil, correctly, not Niall. And that's about the role of the state, and this being a general sketch. Can I deal with the latter point, and then I'll deal with the state and trade unions? In this plan for cooperative socialism, sorry, in this reader, I can't see myself here, so let me try and swipe the screen. It doesn't matter. I'm sure you can see it. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
There is here no more than the size really of a postcard, the 7-point plan. This is as condensed a view of what I'm talking about, what we have been talking about over 25 years, because this is a collective activity. This isn't John coming down from the mount of wherever it is and saying this is the way it should be. There are lots of voices in this, and I could go through that, but that would be it. This is a very tightly defined plan, and at the moment there is a flurry of other plans which, in my view, as of like 20 years ago, were designed to sideline all of this. So the role of the state, well, we could in fact achieve this through the present state apparatus, and that is to have the second chamber in the UK, that's called the House of Lords, elsewhere the Senate, do an annual recommendation to the elected chamber as to, number one, the pound amount or national currency amount of the living income for everyone. Because if everyone gets, figure completely out of the air, if everyone gets £30,000, then there is no control mechanism which will hold people to coercive relationships, be that domestic, workplace or whatever. So an annual recommendation from the second house to the elected house on the dollar or pound or euro amount of the living income. Secondly, that second chamber could make an annual recommendation on the income spread for paid work. So there is a paid cap, a living income down here, a paid work cap. This is enough to live on. This is for people who accept doing drudgery or feel that they're actually worth more than everyone else, and they will have that extra income so that they can go off perhaps and do other things. So I'm not an anarchist. I'm a cooperative, a democratic and cooperative socialist. I was expelled from the Labour Party in February of this year for being anti-Semitic. Me, Quaker, you've got to be joking. And I've got an appeal hearing with the Cooperative Party on Tuesday afternoon of this week, again to expel me from the Cooperative Party for being anti-Semitic. We're dealing here with a way in which we can transform the whole of our communities and the whole of our lives through collective action. And that, to me, necessarily includes a geographically boundaried entity called the state. And that's what the Chartists were all about. That's what the cooperative movement's been all about. That's what the trade unions are all about, the Labour Party, all that merry stuff. So the state has an important role to play. I would, if time had allowed, talk about the role of trade unions in this non-capitalist society, but that for another time.
Thank you very much, John. I don't see any hands up at the minute, and we're pretty much have used all the time we had allocated, but there's just a couple of requests in the chat for you, John, and a couple of comments which you may want to look at and perhaps we could discuss later. The request is if you could share the links to some of the sites you mentioned in the chat, and if you could share your 20-page paper and the link to the Canadian reading.
Thank you, Francesca. I'll look at that when the next speaker is on, not divert from our time together. I think we're at just a minute or so beyond 2, aren't we?
That's right, yes. So thank you very much again, John, for your contribution. Greatly appreciated, and I found it very fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you. So would like to move now to the second speaker for our session, Spreckley, who is going to be talking about social enterprises, a just transition to a regenerative fair future. Do you have some slides, Priya, or are you also going to just be talking? Oh, there you go. Yes, they're up.
Okay. Hello. Good morning. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here. I must confess, not being a very active member of the co-op movement. I was active in the 70s during worker cooperatives, and that's my basic involvement. Today I want to talk about social enterprise, which grew out of the worker co-op movement, and the idea that it's social enterprise is still very much part of the work of the cooperative movement, but it actually goes into new areas of value. So the beginning of social enterprise, I realize we've got a short time, so I'll keep it quite short, and you can have copies of the slides. During the 1970s, when I worked in worker co-ops, we were witnessing at the time the near collapse of co-op societies around the world. And these partly were due to internal conservativeness by senior members. We were not really invited as worker co-ops to become part of the co-op movement, or even to have meetings with people. In the UK, we had obviously the development of the new supermarkets. I think Tesco's was one of them that competed quite heavily with the co-op, and there was basically an oversupply, and co-ops were losing ground and merging all the time, closing down and merging. Internationally, my work over the last 50 years has really been in international development. What I saw in Africa and Asia is really nation states, as they became independent, they took over the co-op societies because the co-op societies were producing cash crops for export. And so nation states started to take over the co-ops increasingly, and therefore undermining their independence. I don't know if you remember the politicking of Thatcher and Reagan, who managed to persuade the United Nations to not support any projects with the word co-op in its title, which, when I was working overseas, had a big impact on availability of resources to support co-ops. I don't know if that's still in existence or not, but it generally had a big impact. And then at the same time, there was a bunch of people working really within ICOM, the Industrial Common Ownership movement, which merged again with the co-op movement later on, set up worker co-ops. And my involvement was that I was an executive director of ICOM, and I was also the manager of Beechwood College. And out of all that problem and all that politicking and all the issues that were going on, the idea of social enterprise started to emerge. And when we presented these ideas from Beechwood College to the co-op movement, generally, the Beechwood College was in Leeds, and the main headquarters of the co-op, of course, is in Manchester. So it was only just, half an hour drive down the road, and we could easily go and meet. But they really weren't that bothered. So we had to sort of work out how we were going to develop these, whether we were going to try and fight with the co-op movement to get them involved and become part of them, or whether we were going to go off and do something quite independent and different. The connection between co-ops and social enterprise is obviously in the values. The co-ops are value driven, so are social enterprises. The structure is more democratic, more egalitarian, and these are part of its success. But also the barrier to relevance. If the co-op movement was not going to change with the times, then that was a really big mistake which the co-op movement made, and actually prevented worker co-ops being involved. We decided that we felt we needed to update the values. There's nothing wrong with the values of the 7 principles of the co-op, but there were other issues. There was environmental issues, there was equality issues, and there was the structure, which people on this conference have talked about quite a lot. The structure was overbearing and required more participation. And listening to speakers through this conference, that seems to still be the case. In 1976, when I was a member of the executive of ICOM, ICOM put through something called the ICO Act, the Industrial Common Ownership Act of 1976. And that really propelled worker co-ops from, ICOM at that time had 13 members. And from 1976 to about 1980, it went from 13 members to over 200 member companies. And it was really due to the worker co-ops. ICOM provided the act that provided a recognition, a legal constitution, and a proper registration system. So it had a huge impact and really was the birth of the worker co-op movement in the UK. However, still, the co-op movement during the 80s, response was lukewarm at very best, and really were not interested in discussing how the worker co-ops could join with the co-op movement. And this became very frustrating for people like myself, who were actively involved in setting up training courses, and we were setting up what we call cooperative development agencies in many, many towns. So in the UK in the early 1980s, there must have been 100 co-op development agencies, all supporting co-ops and working and really working with people, building thousands of co-ops. And the co-op movement just would not really get involved and would not openly support it. And when we looked at the principles of what we were talking about, we found that there's not that much difference. I mean, we just felt we updated it. So the co-op principles of open membership and democratic member control, in social enterprise, we developed more participative democracy. And that again is what's being called for in this conference today. We have member ownership. In social enterprise, we had common ownership. We had a much more directly relationship between the members and ownership, which gave them responsibility and influence and control. The cooperatives have independence, similar with social enterprise. Financial viability was obviously a key principle. Education, concern for communities. In social enterprise, we broadened that out to social wealth. We wanted to include, being less specific and more generally about connecting. Social wealth is really about connecting people, making sure people can work, giving people opportunities to work together. And we felt that the education and concern for communities should be really upgraded. Cooperatives never really in those days, and I'm not even sure today, were that involved in environmental issues. But in the 1970s, many of us felt that the ecology and the environment was really becoming an important area, and we should all take some responsibility. So we have it in the principles of social enterprise to to be responsible for our environment in whatever way we can. And the cooperatives had annual reports, and in social enterprise, we developed social accounting and audit. So, you know, although there's no conflict of interest between these two sets of principles, we felt that the principles needed updating and needed broadening and needed to include some other areas like environment that at that point the co-ops were not really involved in. But we think there's a good working relationship there. Today, I think it's more social enterprise is of its time. It's a much more fluid and as you will mostly know, lots and lots of social enterprises. And as some people said, they're not really social enterprises. They're more private businesses pretending to be social enterprises. That is the case, I have to say. But for us in the social enterprise arena, we wanted to reduce, reuse and recycle, creating and supporting the idea of the circular economy and a much more focused on a regenerative, growth-focused approach, rather than growth in terms of numbers of turnover and numbers of staff, really to regenerate, trying to create a regenerative form of organization and supporting what is now becoming quite popular, the circular economy. Social wealth was much more about a humanist approach to society in which people matter more than pensions and profit. And we again, you know, put a lot of emphasis, and that's why we called the social audit or the social accounting and audit social rather than environmental. We put humans at the very center. And as I said, we tried to build in so that the social enterprise, whatever it does in every way, contributes to a biodiverse planet. Defining social enterprise, this has been a big problem in the history of social enterprise. While we had a definition of social enterprise, it wasn't really adopted fully, and lots of people had different types of interpretation, different types of defining, and there was no agreement, and still today there is no agreement as to how you would define a social enterprise. And this talk that I'm giving now is actually a very concise summary of a book that has been written. I'm now just editing it and getting it published. And I'm making the case that we've always had a social enterprise definition. This is it. Social enterprise is a legally registered organization owned and controlled by its co-owners based on the values of equity and ownership. It trades commercially for financial independence and gain, creates social wealth, and operates in an environmental responsible manner. And social wealth and environmental responsibility are created as an integral part of the enterprise, and also can be something supported through profit distribution or social welfare. The other key definition of the social enterprise that I'm trying to promote at the moment is that it is measured by its success in achieving the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line was something that came up later, but it was based on the definition we first wrote in a publication of a triple line of financial viability, social wealth creation, environmental responsible operations. And we developed a social accounting and audit system, a very kind of basic one, and not too complicated, but one that's sort of been overshadowed by lots and lots of different approaches to what has become known as now social auditing. The social auditing or social accounting and audit that we developed at Beechwood in the late 1970s, it was really based, you know, we had this discussion yesterday a lot about currencies and the difficulty of what currency are we going to use to measure performance of cooperatives. Well, we had that conversation as well. We had all those issues coming out, and really my personal view was that we should allow social enterprises or co-ops who use social auditing to determine their own plan and then monitor and evaluate that plan, not using some external criteria. So we based it on the intentional plans of an enterprise, rather than having some, if you like, extraneous sort of currency. We framed the social audit within the triple bottom line: social wealth, financial viability, and environmental responsibility. And it is undertaken regularly, and it is fully participative. And it uses the hierarchy of objectives, which I will talk to in the next slide. And it is planned, measured, and evaluating using a separate set of indicators. And the indicators don't have to be complex. They have to be matter of fact. People have to understand what they are. And the easiest combination is really a quantity: how many, by when, time, who, targets, and to what quality standards. And those indicators, if you use those components, they make very practical and clear and relatively simply understandable indicators which people can plan, monitor, and evaluate. The other part of the objectives, the hierarchy of objectives, really relate to this. There's now this great growth in the UK, at least, and elsewhere, about the idea of impact evaluation, impact, social impact, all of these areas. And having spent the last 40 years working partly for the European Union, where we introduced this hierarchy of impact, hierarchy of objectives in the 1980s, it was called results-based management. Achieving impact is something that is done. It sometimes takes 1 year, it sometimes takes 20 years. But it's never done by any one organization. It's never done by any one project. It is a contributory process, and it relates to the wider society and benefits that will contribute. Other inputs and initiatives are also contributed to the same impact. Impact is a society-wide, a community-wide result, not a factual thing. The second layer in the hierarchy is the main objectives in terms of continuous benefit being utilized by users. And the language is a bit awkward, but actually it's quite important. So an outcome, an impact is something that happens as a result of something. An outcome is the utilization by the beneficiaries of what they have actually received. Not that they've received it, but what they've used it, and they've got benefit out of that. So if you receive training and you are a qualified accountant, the outcome is you get a good job. You get a high-paying job, if that's what you want. The outputs are the services and facilities that have been received by the beneficiaries. They are the result of the training, for example. There are activities, which is what we provide, what the enterprise provides, resources, services, facilities, use of assets. And then there are inputs, resources, funds, personnel, policy, and assets that are used by the social enterprise. And that hierarchy gives the social audit a framework. And it's really about, the social enterprise operates down here, inputs and activities. That's what it does. It doesn't do outputs, outcome, or impact at all. It provides services. The output is people have received something. and it's made a difference to their life. The outcome is they've used what they've received and they are gaining benefit. And the impact is something which is by people using that, by people gaining benefit, they contribute to society, to their communities. And this hierarchy is really quite straightforward, but it does give us an important contribution. Okay, thank you. So I've been hurried on, sorry. So social enterprise has become too difficult, too many interpretations, and we just need to really decide, like the co-ops, what we're going to do. So my proposal in the book that I've written is that we have a Social Enterprise Act that's similar to the ICO Act. We create a Social Enterprise Act, and it's not as an alternative to co-ops, but as a partnership. And the components of the Act is a social enterprise. We have an accepted social enterprise definition. We have an Act of Parliament. We have a model constitution. We have a body designated to register social enterprise, and we have a funded body to promote social enterprise and organizations. Who will take responsibility for this? Well, I think the co-op movement is a much bigger organization, and with social enterprise could really be quite important in promoting such a thing. The tripartite values caught the imagination of the world, and social enterprise became a global movement. So around the world, just like co-ops, social enterprises are known all over the world. But the inability of national and international groups to consolidate and define a clear, straightforward approach is missing. And in the meantime, the world's getting poorer, hotter, and less caring. And therefore, it is now time to be responsible for what we believe in and put aside any differences to form new working definitions and support mechanisms for global development of social enterprise and co-ops. And I would say that that co-ops can also use social accounting and audit. It would suit them very well, and I think it's quite feasible for social enterprises and the co-op movement to really work together in forming a more straightforward approach, and not to be disrespectful, but to have less academics involved and more people who just work in their local co-ops. Sorry about that, Rory, but or anybody else. Okay, so it's us that can do it, and I would suggest that we should try and do that. Thank you very much. Sorry for the delay.
Thank you very much, Freer. That was really fascinating and very rich, and actually you were perfect on timekeeping, so thank you also for that. The floor is open for comments or questions, if there are any.
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh yeah, hi.
Hi, have I got the floor?
Yes, you do.
Okay, just want to make two points. I do remember Manuela Sykes, and I was very conversant with what you were describing around the conservative nature of the cooperative movement at the time, Freer. I think you're rather unkind, actually, because there were some cooperative societies such as Royal Arsenal and their political committee, who I think provided the first officers for ICOM. And I can well remember my mother, Hilda, who was chair of RSCS's political committee, telling me at the time that the political secretary's PA or secretary had to move in with the political secretary so they could free up space for ICOM to have their headquarters in their Woolwich headquarters. But the work of the RSCS political committee also extended to putting in regional development motions to Labour Party conference in 1976. very strongly supporting the development of local CDAs. And in fact, RACS supported a number of CDAs in the South London area during the late 70s and early 80s. And what was quite interesting at the time is that when Callaghan became Prime Minister, he offered the Co-op Party an opportunity of a national CDA. And when the civil service asked for a briefing, the cupboard was bare. The Co-op Party hadn't really worked out what it was that they actually wanted. And there was a conference, I think, that was held at the Co-op College around June of 1976, which was very unproductive, and nothing really came out of that event. And I'm relating that to the importance of the affiliation of the RACS political committee to the Labour Party. So just putting in a little bit of history there, in case it's lost in the passage of time. And I think it relates interestingly back to what John was saying earlier on about the shipyards in that locality and the way they were influencing the formation of the cooperative movement in South London. The other point, very much more briefly though, is about Wales. Quite astonishingly to my mind, the Wales Cooperative Centre, which is a national CDA in Wales, employs 70 people. Very few are involved in cooperative development at all, I might add. They have been acting essentially as a secretariat and have put together and have got the agreement of the Minister to a social enterprise vision and mission strategy. And it really is a mixture of all different licorice, all sorts, frankly. And if you look at the document, the only reference to cooperative is when they actually make a comment about the centre actually chairing the group. There's no other reference to cooperative in that entire document, which I found most astonishing. Thank you.
Okay. Shall I answer this each one just quickly? I mean, sure. I'm very aware of the support of the Labour Party and of the particular co-op society you mentioned, David. Manuela Sykes was, of course, a key member of ICOM during those years, and we're all very aware of her contribution. And
what a character.
And what a character indeed. The co-op movement was also very supportive of ICOM in many ways. And the ICO Act was put through by Labour MPs, which I think were members of the Co-op Party. So absolutely, there has been some good cooperation. I actually live in Wales, and I agree with you that the Welsh programme here is something which I don't really understand very much. I'm sorry. Okay, Rory, did you want to say something?
We've got Ian, who had his hand up first. Then, if we have time, Leslie, I'd like to take Leslie's question.
I'll give way to Leslie and Ian. Yeah.
Yes, I was planning to do that because you had a chance to intervene earlier, Rory, and perhaps there'll be time towards the end. So, Ian first, and Leslie, could I ask you to be brief and straight to the point, please?
Sure. Right. My experience with social enterprise is through contact with recently formed ones, or relatively recently, 10 years ago, in response to the incoming health administration. I think it was the fag end of New Labour that encouraged community nursing functions to form social enterprises. And I got involved as a member of a patient participation group, which might be part of a participative democratic structure, and saw the development of this social enterprise. Now, the constitution was put together by KPMG, you know, those noteworthy democratic management consultants who weren't very keen to have an elected staff representative on the board. And they had to be a fierce fight with the people setting up the social enterprise to get an elected member of staff on. However, it kicked off, and the nurses that led this thing have got loads of energy and we're amazingly resourceful. But as time has gone on, the financial squeeze has started to bite. And the thing that's happened is it's gone from this health-led initiative and innovation into a very much a cost-driven environment. And our patient participation group is now seen as a bit rebellious, and we keep getting new constitutions that say that we've got to stay on message, otherwise they'll jump on us. So I'm critical of some of the co-ops that have well established and gone to root, but that seems to happen really quickly in a social enterprise, quite a big one. And we've had Circle as well, who claim to be a social enterprise and were really just a front for city hucksters. So I've probably got a bit of a jaundiced view, but it's that democratic bit I think needs to be formally constituted and needs to have energy to maintain it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is why I think, like Roger Spear has just mentioned, hello, Roger, there are lots of different definitions and interpretations of social enterprise, and there are many organizations that call themselves social enterprise, but they're actually private businesses run, but using social enterprise as a sort of marketing tool. And we've seen things like Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, do social auditing, and we've seen the Body Shop do social auditing. But if you look at the questions that they asked themselves, there were never things about who owned it, whether that was right or wrong, who managed the organization. So these were just marketing tools that they use. And that's why I'm emphasizing that really we need to get a proper definition. And unless we have a proper definition, we don't really have, a social enterprise. We just have organizations that are, that either are masquerading or actually are very lukewarm, like the one you described with the nurses. But if you have a proper definition and a proper Act of Parliament, then it kind of establishes what it is, and people choose to join it or not join it.
Thank you. I'd like to take very briefly, if possible, Leslie's question at this point, and then move on to the third paper.
I'm always being told to be brief, Francesca.
Sorry about that. I didn't even know it. It's just the timing of it.
Particularly by Rory. Freya, this is almost a repeat of a conversation that we had in a hotel in Hereford about 3 years ago.
It is,
and you and I think basically take the same kind of line. David, with reference to Royal Arsenal, at the time that you're talking about, I represented the affiliated political committees of those London co-op societies on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, so I very much remember your mum very well. Have to say that wasn't the only thing that Royal Arsenal was putting forward in those days, but I have to agree with David, they did try. Back to what Freya was saying though, Freya, the problem with the definitional plea that you're making, and if I may say so, the problem with the overall case that you're making is that unfortunately the definition of social enterprise which is being pushed by Social Enterprise UK, the definition of social enterprise which is now being pushed by a lot of organisations purporting to recognise or represent social enterprises in the UK at the moment, as we both know, their definition isn't the same as yours. The problem is that a lot of the definitions, including those being advanced by Social Enterprise London originally, by Social Enterprise UK, very much those organisations don't see any problem in the involvement of private, see much of a problem in returns to investors. That's what community interest companies are all about. So I have to say that though obviously very much I agree with your interpretation, and many of us share your interpretation of what social enterprise is all about, that's not unfortunately the only view of what a social enterprise is which is being put forward. The only other thing that I would say about what your suggestion was about the Social Enterprise Act, I was on John McDonnell's implementation group for trying to double the size of the co-op economy before the last election. I have to say that when we went around the country asking the co-op movement what we ought to try and put in the manifesto, to be candid with you, they weren't really very well prepared. And so I would say to colleagues here, and I would say to other colleagues in the rest of the wider co-op movement, if we're going to be thinking about a new act, first of all, we need to agree on what that act ought to be saying, and we ought to be phrasing the kind of stuff that we're saying, particularly based on the case that Freer has been putting forward, in the way that it could be incorporated into a future Labour Party manifesto. I mean, it certainly isn't going to be incorporated into a Tory manifesto, particularly a Johnson Party manifesto. So if we want to get that kind of thing to a Clause 5 meeting in the Labour Party, if we want to get those kind of ideas and that kind of definition, hopefully advanced once more by the Labour Party, we ought to get together and we ought to agree what kind of representations we ought to be making from now on in.
Thank you.
That's all I'm going to say, Francesca.
Sorry, thank you for that. Do you have a response in 30 seconds, or can I leave you just to discuss during the coffee break?
I will discuss it with Leslie later on, yes.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry that I have to rush the discussion, but we've got a third speaker who's been patiently waiting, and that's Rory Ridley-Duff, who's going to talk about new cooperativism as social innovation. Over to you, Rory, and sorry for the slight delay. We cannot hear you. You're muted.
Just unmute myself. Sorry. I was being very disciplined, not joining in that debate about the definition there.
Well done, Rory.
Right, so while this is starting, could you see that? Yeah. So there's a good connection between what Free has just been talking about and what I'm going to talk about. So I'm just in the starting process of preparing a book on new cooperativism, and my mouse is not working, which is not. This is an early stage thought process about the connection between new cooperativism and social innovation. And the reason I connect it to Freer's work is in a paper that Mike Bull and I wrote in 2019, we looked at the period 1978 up to 1997, which is the period in which Freer was very active in the generation and mission of social enterprise. And what we argue is that this is the beginnings of new cooperativism. Yeah. From 1997 onwards, when the government got involved, that was when the concept got diluted. So the purpose of this paper is to look at Vieta's theory of new cooperativism. They had a special issue of a journal, a number of papers looking at this theory of new cooperativism. I would say inspired probably by the recovered companies of Argentina, the worker co-ops in Argentina. But certainly it's expanded beyond that. So what I wanted to look at is how new cooperativism and social innovation may interrelate. What social innovations are being advocated by practitioners of new cooperativism, and whether these are seen as progressive or regressive. So progressive in the sense of advancing to a new higher condition, or regressive as in terms of returning to values or systems of the past. And there's quite an interesting conversation to be had there. So I'm going to touch on social innovation, touch on new cooperativism. The method of the study has been to purposefully sample texts from 3 organisations that are advancing new forms of cooperation: the P2P Foundation, the Commons Transition Movement, and the Fair Shares Association. So based on those texts, how does Vieta's theory of new cooperativism hold up? And how might we? So I'm actually going to suggest some revisions to Vieta's theory at the end of this exploration of what these 3 networks are saying. So firstly, I've resisted reading about social innovation because in my gut, I thought it was a watering down of the social enterprise principles that Freya's been talking about, but actually on engaging with it, there's something quite interesting. There was a very good paper by Ibe and Teasdale and a third author whose name escapes me at the moment. They were looking at the most established authors in the field of social innovation theory, and they discovered weak and strong trends. The strong trend is based on changes to social relations, power, structures and institutions, very much empowering and enfranchising more people so they can participate in solutions. And you can easily see the connection for what co-ops could do, and indeed those participatory social enterprises that Freya's been talking about. And that is actually the dominant view from about 2008 onwards. So this is the definition that is contained within that paper. So new forms of collaboration, less hierarchical relationships, leading to new ideas that benefit a community or wider society, which again, I think we can easily match that into mutual self-help. They represented it like this, and they talked about co-production, or the elements of co-production. So you can see the split down here between new forms of power relations and then the sort of social value of a technical innovation. And the reason I wanted to show this diagram is because when we begin to look at the writers on new cooperativism, we see the term co-production and co-innovation coming into the language. So there's one more thing I want to just alert us to on social innovation. That paper was about social policy. Tracy and Stott have looked at organisation management, and they differentiate between entrepreneurship leading to innovation for social impact, which is through the creation of new organisations, social entrepreneurship, which is about changing the structures of existing organisations in order to enfranchise more people and make it more participatory and change social outcomes. And then also the creation of platforms that enable organisations to work with each other on social impact. So this is more at the ecosystem level. So we've got venture creation, venture development, and then ecosystem development. And that, if we use their theory, we can begin to look at the different elements of Vietta's model and understand that it's not all one thing, that it's operating at different levels. So what do we know about new cooperativism at the moment? Still at the beginning of my reading on this, but it's expanding all the time. So Vietta looks at the work of Gibson Graham, and you can see here contemporary cooperative experiments that engage in co-production and co-invention of solidarity economies or community economies. So that debate we had about the solidarity economy is part of this conversation about new cooperativism. And the other thing that I think is of note, and this appears again and again, does not necessarily manifest as formally constituted co-ops. So there are papers I put out about the cooperative practices in associations or social businesses, which do stack up quite well against cooperative values and principles, but they're not formally constituted as co-ops. And I think there's a bit of a crossover to Edgar's arguments yesterday about different forms of mutual self-help as well. So the emphasis is on mutual aid amongst others. Sorry, somebody's laughing there. So what happens if we try to look at Vietta's model? So Vietta talked about action by working people and citizens, and here this is very much about the entrepreneurial process, how the ventures, how the services, how the products come into being, and that these are happening independent from what people have been calling the legacy co-op movement, the old, what I call old cooperativism. Then we've got stuff about entrepreneurship, the changing of the rules within the organisation to distribute the social wealth, the financial surpluses more equitably, the engaging with the other and the planet, that ties in with what Freya was saying about the origins of social enterprise in the 1970s. And then we've got the horizontal labour processes and decision-making. So flatter decision-making structures, more egalitarian wage policies. And then the extrapreneurship comes with the social objectives and the community development initiatives. So actually looking out to the rest of the ecosystem. So I think there's some mileage in using social innovation theory to understand the different elements of new cooperativism. But I'm going to revisit this when we've looked at the 3 examples. So the methodology was to identify networks with a good range of materials, so that they have wikis, websites, both practitioner and peer-based publications, and that these networks have a critique of the cooperative movement, but also are sympathetic and want to evolve it. So I kept searching their sources for cooperative with or without the hyphen. John Courtneige says about the difference between co-op and Anglo cultures and the rest of the world. And that obviously surfaces bits in the text where there is mention of cooperatives and cooperativism. So based on that, I purposely sampled from those sources. I've chosen 10 works, if you like, from each of them, and then put these through qualitative analysis software called NVivo. So what I do is I code the text of those texts using the theory of new cooperativism, using the social innovation theory of Tracy and Stott, but also seeing if there is text that does not fall within that theory, to see whether the theory itself needs to be revised or expanded, and I do believe that it needs to be. The purpose of doing a critical discourse analysis is to understand the reproduction of power. So we're talking about new cooperatives' view of old cooperativism. What is old cooperativism doing in order to not yield power to new cooperatives? And of course, the solutions that they come up with are an implicit critique of old co-ops. And we've actually visited that ground quite well in Freya's discussion. So I've picked out for this presentation 3 areas where I think there's quite a strong critique. The first is that co-ops have ceased to be part of radical political movements and they're integrated into the capitalist order. The things they lobby for are really not that groundbreaking anymore, and they're not mobilizing to combat capitalism. I see within my peer group those who are quite happy to split cooperatives across capitalist and socialist, that they sit in both camps. So they're really critiquing the ones that have been co-opted into the capitalist system. The second one is more about the extrapreneurship, the capacity of the co-op movement to build an ecosystem to develop co-ops is not strong compared to the modes of organisation that it's competing with to produce products and services. So here, they're particularly arguing that cooperative structures should be expanded and interconnected to aggregate collective knowledge. And this is where the platforms of the peer-to-peer foundation and the co-op transition movement and the Fair Shares Association, they're all trying to put into the commons, if you like, an intellectual commons out there of how to pursue new cooperativism. And I would say that the strongest argument that comes out of the Fair Shares Association is the single stakeholder co-op. That solidarity between stakeholders is vital. Otherwise, you encourage a philanthropic mindset. So once one stakeholder group is preeminent within a co-op, they expect everybody else to adopt a philanthropic mindset in order to support their efforts to leverage rather than sharing or mutualizing the benefits between the stakeholder groups. The benefits go to a single stakeholder group. So that's the critique of old cooperativism. What about I can only give you tiny little snippets of the way that they're basically, I built a table of the data and then put that table into NVivo and coded it. So these are just 3 quotes, one from each organization. So on the social entrepreneurship, the venture creation, there seems to be a theme around progressive democratization, which entails this governance matrix, citizen participation in the design and delivery of human services. And I know that Ian had a bad experience in a public sector spin out, and the research evidence is that mostly it's a bad experience, but there are some very good experiences as well. But some of these comments are being made on the basis of the Catalan integrated co-op, which seems to be a much more positive experience, and the development of the cooperative and solidarity economy in Catalonia and Barcelona and beyond. So it's radical. This is in my work in the Fair Shares labs, we used the living labs approach to bring users into a venture even before the venture was incorporated. Intrapreneurship, I think the most interesting thought process, and Maureen, I hope is still with us. This comes from a paper that we put it out in joint names, but Maureen really wrote it and I edited it. And Maureen argues that Fair Shares goes beyond rethinking capitals to actually recognising the contributions that are made and then providing returns for different forms of capital contribution. And one thing I've realised in this process is that the orientation of all three networks towards multi-stakeholder co-ops and a preference for multi-stakeholder co-ops goes hand in hand with the recognition of different types of capital contribution. Once you begin to think of capital in terms of human, social, intellectual, and financial capital, and you recognise that each contributor is participating in your co-op, then you have to think about how you enfranchise them as members and how they share in the surplus that is generated by that enterprise. And those surpluses are not just financial, of course. Those surpluses might be in terms of intellectual property and things like that that you create. On the extrapreneurship front, I chose this P2P Foundation comment about the Catalan integrated co-op. And it shows the integrated nature of what they're trying to do. So tie together consumer and labour initiatives, so bringing together the two member groups that are recognised within Fair Shares, but also in education, basic income, eco-stores, collective stores, meetings, events, legal structure. This is very much ecosystem building, and of all of the projects that were on offer in the project, this seemed to be the best example I could find of social entrepreneurship. So how does that affect the theory of Vieta? What you see here is the parts in green are a disaggregation of things that have been conflated in Vieta's theory. So I think you can look at the action by citizens separately to the actions by working people. That doesn't mean there's not a relationship between the two. But if you're doing a piece of research, you would want to study what the citizens are doing, study what people in work roles are doing, and look at the interrelationships between them. And I think it helps to separate them out. He conflated horizontal labour process with egalitarian surplus sharing, but horizontal labour processes might be nothing to do with surplus sharing. It might be all to do with decision making. So I think you need to look at the horizontal labour processes separately from what the organisations are doing in terms of sharing surplus. The 6 capitals, I found the most sophisticated articulation of this comes on the Fair Shares Association work, but there is good coverage on P2P Foundation as well. There's not much coverage in Commons Transition on a breadth of capitals, but the equitable access to those capitals is, I think, an issue, and of course that ties in with ethical engagement with environmental responsibility and the planet. The 2 new ones are in red: multi-stakeholder orientation. All 3 networks speak positively about multi-stakeholder design, and commoning. All of them are committed to creating commons resources. So this speaks to the ecosystem arguments again, the joining up of different networks. And they all actively use licenses that permit sharing and distribution of ideas across, including product ideas or designs. Out of this, I've got a sense of where Vieta is going. How much time have I got, Francesca?
About 3 minutes.
Okay, that's good, that's fine. Now, progress or regress, this is quite interesting because a lot of the ideas in new cooperativism are not that new. And this conference, the idea of the commons, we can trace this back to Cooperative Commonwealth, which has a very long history. There was a Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in 1932 that got power in Canada, parts of Canada. And I found papers about a very loud, well-articulated idea of the labour commons that long predate this, but it's clearly there and it's survived as an idea. I also think it's sensitive to the political values that you bring to bear. So I'm not in favour of neoliberalism, but if you were a neoliberal, this stuff would fill you with horror. You would see this as regressive. You would see this as going back to the 70s or even pre-70s. Within the old co-op movement, you would probably see mutual aid. I mean, there's been a lot of antagonism to worker co-ops throughout the history of the co-op movement, and also the idea of multi-stakeholder. People see it as maybe endangering the common bonds. So there are certain things that are held as important in the old co-op movement that might react to this. Certainly, it would be seen as progressive within the new co-op movement because of the pluralist turn. I would say this more pluralistic view of communitarian philosophy, the notion of joint property in commons with other members. But I think also the idea of trying to create equality between interest groups as well as individual people is a communitarian perspective, not just a liberal perspective. I think there are two things where there's particular sensitivity. The question of whether creating commons resources weakens members' democratic control over those resources. If it's a commons and anybody or more people can use them, does that weaken democratic control? And then the multi-stakeholder orientation, particularly if it enfranchises people who contribute financial capital, is that a compromise of old cooperative values and principles? There is something I think is new though, and that is the strength and the depth of the discourse around labour. I think we've seen through Freer's work that the social enterprise movement initially was created because the old cooperative movement was not allowing worker co-ops into the governing bodies of the movement. And I think the same is true here. New cooperativism, a lot of the works from South America, based on Italy, based on Spain, emphasize the growing relevance of worker membership. Even in the UK, we've seen the employee ownership movement grow massively, even more than the worker co-op movement. And I think the link between multiple capitals and multi-stakeholder design principles, that to me is also a new development in thinking and theory. So my interim conclusions very quickly. I hope this paper takes forward the discussion of new cooperativism and adds the dimensions of commoning and multi-stakeholder orientation to the theory. I think it explores the relativistic nature of progress and regress. There is some looking back and looking forward here. I think the link between multiple forms of capital or wealth and multi-stakeholder design principles, I have not realised how strong that connection is before elaborating this. And that old cooperativism reproduces its existing power structures by accepting the discourses of capitalism, particularly in its narrow view of capital, as capital only being financial capital. You look at the blueprint for the cooperative decade, they have a chapter on capital. It's all about financial capital. And that's it. Open to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Rory. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
I'll stop sharing now.
Are there questions or comments for Rory? Freer, do you want to go? But you're muted.
Yes, that's very interesting, Rory. I mean, are you suggesting then that that really all these new co-ops from worker co-ops onwards are sort of always outside the traditional co-op movement? And is that what you're finding? And if that is the case, I mean, are we looking for what is the role of the co-op movement if it doesn't move with the times?
I think new cooperativism has begun to change the institutions of old cooperativism. If we think of the Co-op Commission in 2001 in the UK, finally they admitted a wide range of co-ops, and we've seen other forms of co-ops, like housing co-ops and schools co-ops, increase their voice within the movement. internationally, the ICA have done a recent piece of work on co-op classification, where they finally have a working definition of multi-stakeholder co-ops, which requires no single stakeholder to have a dominant voice. So if it's 60-40, that's a consumer co-op or a worker co-op. But if they've both got 40% and there's a third stakeholder with 20%, that's a multi-stakeholder co-op. So they're beginning to recognize this, the new cooperative movement has influenced the old institutions, and I see that as positive.
Ian has his hand raised. Ian, would you like to speak?
Is it Roger? You are?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that very erudite run through. I'm wondering how many people are actually familiar with the new cooperative movement. My guess is it's quite small in the UK.
Yeah, I mean it's got a healthy following within, I think, research and practice circles, particularly in South America, where Marcelo Vieta will have been doing his work. He's also been studying Italian social co-ops in some detail. I'll catch up with his latest work. Yeah.
The substantive point, though, was that under New Labour, I found it really frustrating that all the investment went into social enterprise. So all the theorising, all the development of funding models and of grants and all the rest of it was going into something that hadn't actually been proven. We had a social enterprise East Midlands, they got resources all over the place, and yet within the co-op movement we were generating all the experience and actually working, you know, cooperatives.
Some of those movements were well disposed to co-ops, others less. I mean, I can remember at conferences people saying, you know, in Wales you can't get social enterprise support unless you're a co-op, and yet in other parts of the country people were saying if you're a co-op you can't get social enterprise support.
Yeah, well, our experience, I mean, even within the co-op party, the co-op councillors were spending millions on social enterprise centres because I think they were a bit nervous about co-ops. You know, they're more difficult to control. So, I mean, that was the frustration. So I think if the co-op movement in the UK has got a bit behind, I think it's been fighting a rearguard action since Thatcher came along and started trying to demutualise everything.
It could have organised more. It could have organised more to ensure that the co-op model was well recognised within the social enterprise framework. I think there were some decisions to withdraw from that debate, which possibly, with hindsight, was a mistake. Yeah.
Well, there was an article in the Observer, you know. That
there's two others. There's two. John and Roger want to contribute as well, I think.
Sorry, I'm not seeing their hand.
Roger Spear and John Courtneige have both had their hand up.
Oh, sorry for that. They just don't appear on my screen. But Roger, would you like to take the floor, please?
Okay, thanks very much, Rory. That was a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. The part of it that I'm kind of quite fascinated by is the extrapreneurship part, because then you're looking at, you know, the transformative potential of you know, local initiatives and whatever, you know. And we've seen in the past some really interesting things like you know, this, as Freya was talking about, the 70s and 80s worker co-op movement, and I think you know, other ways in which local initiatives can be scaled up, and it's one of the things that I think is interesting is the literature on transformational social innovation, and there they talk about networks and movements for collective action. Unfortunately, they do kind of end up with a paradox perspective. For example, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, which kind of doesn't fill you with optimism about where it's going. But I do think that literature is worth pursuing. And I think, you know, for example, your example of Barcelona. I mean, Barcelona had you know, a very strong anti-austerity mayor, and has for a long time had cooperatives and employee ownership structures at the local and region and Catalan level, and so the capacity of those structures to scale up local initiatives and to build cross-sector collaborations, I think is very powerful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't yet integrated the transformative social innovation literature into the paper. I think I'm going to run out of space, but there has been a study at Roskilde, one of your students, on the alignment of the fair shares model with transformative innovation, and they found a high degree of alignment, except they have some criticisms of the capacity for hierarchical management to develop. We've had some conversations about that ever since. But yeah, that's a really helpful bit of feedback. Thanks.
Thanks. I know we had someone else lined up for a question, but in the interest of timekeeping, I would suggest that perhaps that conversation occurs over during the coffee break. And so I would like to draw this session to a close by thanking all our three speakers for really interesting and stimulating presentations today. Really, really, really good stuff. And I would also like to thank all the participants to this session. So we are now into our coffee break time, which will